In this STOic TTX training video, we'll cover how to build a scenario for a STOic TTX exercise. This video is going to be specifically for STOic TTX because our approach is a little different. Most other tabletop exercise frameworks have a database or a library of scenarios with all the details, all of the injects, everything built in, so the facilitator just opens up the book, works through the scenario, and then moves forward. STOic TTX takes a completely different approach because it is participant-focused, not scenario-focused. Also, we wanted the entire experience, and we wanted the organization to be running exercises all year round, and we wanted it to be fast, flexible, and fun. So to do this, STOic TTX doesn't come with a library of pre-built scenarios. Instead, we've broken the scenarios down into the different areas, and it's the facilitator's job to bring in the resources to provide those things to the scenario as needed during the exercise. You build a scenario after you've identified who the attendees are, what level you're going to be doing the exercise on, be it operational, strategic, or tactical, and you want to typically know what the threat is that they want to exercise. Some organizations don't care. Often they do have a specific concern about a specific threat, be it ransomware or phishing or DDoS or something. And you can use that as a basis for determining what that threat ought to be for this exercise. STOic TTX comes with a list of core threats that we feel every organization needs to prepare for. And this list is backed up by NIST and the MITRE organization as the list of the top threats that every organization needs to prepare for. And this list is viruses, distributed denial service attacks, unauthorized computer on the network, malicious external scanning, malicious internal scanning, computer compromise, phishing, and ransomware. And between these threats, these cover most of the general threats for any organization. Now, the organization you are exercising might have threats that they're concerned about that are not on that list, and that's fine too. It doesn't matter what the threat is as long as it's relevant to that organization. The list provided by STOic is a suggestion based on general criteria. That said, if you, as a facilitator, want to bring in scenarios from outside sources, that's perfectly fine too. The choice is up to the facilitator, and whatever resources work for you, then that's great. Bring those in and use them. The one thing we caution you on is trying to force the scenario and force the details on the participants who might not be ready for that. And we'll get into that and how to dynamically craft a scenario during an exercise in the Delivering a Scenario video. There are sources of pre-made scenarios or just pre-made threats which are interesting that are out there. Some of them are commercially available, some of them you have to buy, some of them are provided free by various organizations. And in the training guide, we have a list of a handful of sources where you can get inspiration or fully formed scenarios with injects and details that you can use. If I can use a Dungeons & Dragons analogy here, or any other tabletop role-playing game analogy, we want to be able to make sure that the scenario isn't a railroad, that there's only one conclusion and only one thing can happen in the scenario. Because if that happens, it becomes a little unrealistic for the participants, and they feel like there's no choice, and there's only one outcome that's possible, and nothing that they do matters. And we don't want to introduce that. What we want to do is to provide a core idea, a core scenario, a core threat, and then modify that to the participants. And so what we need is a list of those initial threats, available details that the facilitator can draw on if necessary, but mostly we want a list of injects that are really useful for those threats. And the training guide provides a list of those injects, and we'll cover off a little bit of how to use those injects in this video. By providing flexible and dynamic resources, the facilitator creates the scenario on the fly. The scenario is created as a collaborative conversation between the participants and the facilitator to make sure it fits the needs, the abilities, and the expectations of the participant groups. This isn't about the facilitator and what the facilitator has prepared for in the scenario. This is about whether or not the scenario challenges the participants. And for that, you need dynamic resources and not a railroad. So in building the scenario, you need 4 elements. You need the threat. You need to know the level at which you are providing the scenario, whether operational, tactical, or strategic. You need to know what that initial impact is, that thing that presents itself to the responders, to the organization that they now need to respond to. And you need to have injects. So those 4 things you need to be able to gather. After you get a little bit of experience in facilitating, you will be able to pull this together extremely quickly, even at the exercise itself in extreme cases. But thinking of the process in terms of gathering and deciding on those 4 things makes it a lot easier. The threat is the main issue, risk, the thing that the organization wants to be able to prepare for. Be it ransomware, distributed denial of service attacks, viruses, phishing, whatever that is, you need to decide on the threat. Sometimes that choice is made by the organization during the preparation stage, that they want to be able to exercise their response to phishing. So that is oftentimes provided by the organization, but not always. As a facilitator, you can choose, again, which threat is going to be relevant to that group, and even which one you want to be able to run with that particular organization. The level of the scenario determines the details in the injects, because you don't want to provide technical details and technical injects to a strategic exercise most of the time. Sometimes they want those details, most often they don't. So you need to be able to provide the details that are relevant to the threat at the level that you're going to be exercising. So at the strategic level, typically they're interested in managing communications, legal, doing resource management, knowing the technical details, for instance, of which server went down in which order and what type of ransomware it is, doesn't matter at that level. So preparing those details isn't always very, very useful. Sometimes you need to have some of those details in your back pocket to pull out because someone might ask, but as a primary preparation step, you don't need to do that. And if they ask those questions that you're not prepared for, I got a tip for you. Fake it. The initial impact is what presents itself first. This could be an alert. This could be a help desk ticket. This could be a support call. This could be a warning email from your defenses. Whatever that is, your SIEM might pop up an alert. Whatever that initial impact is what kicks off the chain of events of responses by the participants. And you need to choose what that initial impact is first, because that's the first thing you're going to say in terms of presenting the scenario. Now, there are a lot of tips and tricks on what to do here. Typically, what you want is a very, very simple, very generic initial impact, and then you can expand and make it more complex after the participants respond to that very, very generic introduction. You can get really clever by understanding what the sequence is of an attack. For instance, if you know, or if you've researched, or if you've experienced yourself a full timeline of an attack, you could start at the very beginning of the timeline and work your way forward, the initial impact starting at the start of the timeline. Or, and this might take some experience in cybersecurity and incident response, but you could start the entire process in the middle of the attack And the participants then discover the full extent of the incident and the full extent of what's going on as they progress through their response, and you can bring in the details of what had happened before that initial impact. But that's more of an advanced thing. Typically, and for a new facilitator, it's really simple. You want to come up with something generic, very easy, and very simple, and have the participants respond to that. So for ransomware, typically it's going to be your antivirus alerts on ransomware, or someone has submitted a ticket or asked for help because it looks like they have ransomware in their machine, and then grow from there. For denial of service, you're looking at a server or a web service that is no longer responding, and you either have users complaining or an alert from the systems that the system is no longer responding. So start off really simple, really general, and then build from there. And we'll get into how to deliver a scenario and all of its complexities and fun in the next video. Injects are a way for the facilitator to really have control over the scenario and make it fit the participant group precisely and make it a lot more fun for everyone involved. Injects change the scenario in some way. Either it progresses the sequence of steps, it progresses through the timeline, or it can just simply change the details of the scenario. In the training guide, we've included a list of different types of really simple injects that you can use and grow a really basic scenario into something more complex in an organic way and in a really, really easy way. Some of those options are volumetric injects, where you simply increase the number of things going wrong or the number of things being affected, changing the user criticality of the scenario. So you start off, for instance, with an average user, and then you change the user to someone from the C-suite, senior manager, or to a core lead developer who has access to highly sensitive information and the code and the servers in the organization, or the system administrators themselves. So you can change the person involved and their access and their level of criticality and risk in the organization to change and mutate the threats and risk to the organization. And all you need to do is start off with something simple and generic, like we mentioned before, and then add these details in as necessary. Instead of user criticality, you can do system criticality as well, from an end user device to a web server to an Active Directory server, which tends to be the core of most networks, to the backup servers, to the virtualized environment. And you can bring in a changing nature, either replacing what was affected with something new. Instead of the end user device, what if it was the web server? For more tactical and more strategic type of scenarios, you can then bring in external pressures. This is where I love to bring in mainstream media calling up, wanting to know what's going on and how does senior management respond to that. Having users within the incident using social media to talk about the incident, having the attackers themselves contact the organization about the incident and making demands or extortion notes, or these other external pressures that come in. You can also have certain resources be unavailable. There might be reasons for this to happen. Sometimes there is not. If you understand the flow of an incident, you can tie the loss of those resources to the scenario by making it up out of your head as you go along, or you can use a legitimate chain of events from real attacks. But in any case, you can start pulling out some of the resources that the organization would depend on in an incident, like the phones, like email, like the loss of a key worker. Now, I love losing a key worker as an inject in all this. As the participants start talking about how they'd respond, usually there's one person who emerges that everyone expects to be key in the incident response. And I love putting an inject to remove that person from the incident. And what I love to do is give them an imaginary baby. It doesn't matter if they're male or female. Imagine that they or their spouse has given birth or they've adopted a brand new child and they are unavailable. Oftentimes people will put in an inject where that key person goes on holiday, but the typical response is, well, then I would come in out of my holiday, or I'd contact, or I'd remote in. So I switched to a baby inject because from experience, you are not going to be as available to an incident if you've just had a baby than if you're just on holiday. And so that creates a little bit of extra tension and potentially a little humor in the incident as well. The other simple inject that we suggest in the guide is changing the time or disclosing the time in the scenario. For instance, that it is a Friday afternoon, or that it's 2 o'clock on a Sunday morning, or that it's Christmas Day, or some other highly critical time within the organization's life. There are often times where there are such critical processes happening that the time an attack happens or an incident happens can remove resources, increase stress, or provide an incredible amount of pressure for the incident responders. Knowing a little bit about those times can provide a lot of stress in a scenario and provide the facilitator a lot of room to explore the unknowns and the gaps in how the organization and the participants respond to an incident. So that list of simple injects and how you can use them and what level they typically can apply is in the guide. I want to show you an example of how this can work. So let's imagine that the scenario is ransomware and the level is operational. We can start off very, very simply. And that is, it's Friday afternoon and someone reports that they have ransomware on their laptop. What do? It's a very simple, very generic start to the scenario, but we've set ourselves up for adding more details or greater sequences depending upon how the participants respond. The facilitator can very, very easily hone in on different aspects and really dig into how the participants respond by then adding things like the user is the CFO or the user is a system administrator. Or they can add things like, and it's Christmas Day. So you've started off with one time constraint being a Friday afternoon, and now you've mutated it to a completely different and more serious time constraint, and that it's Christmas Day. So having these injects at hand, being able to pull these in the middle of an exercise is really important. So the preparation step in building a scenario is having sort of this pool of injects that you can pull from. Let's take the same scenario and change it from an operational level to a strategic level. So it's ransomware, it's Friday afternoon. How do we present this at the strategic level, at the most senior management level? Well, remember that at the most senior management level, a single ransomware event isn't going to be interesting and typically doesn't trigger the involvement of senior management. So we need to step up the volume right away in this particular instance. So we have, for instance, and I'm making this up at the top of my head, we have 500 end-user machines with ransomware. What do? And for senior management, knowing that there is a widespread problem that is not being contained very well yet means that they need to respond. And you can see how they respond, see what questions they ask, and then add an appropriate inject like, and then the email servers go down. The point there is not we need to get the email server back up, but is how does the senior management respond to the incident without email? What if the phone systems also went down? If the phone system was connected to the network, that's a real possibility in a ransomware incident. So as a potential inject, you start taking away those resources and figuring out how the participants might respond with the loss of those resources. And of course, as I mentioned before, at the strategic level, my very favorite thing to do is to add the fact that the media is calling because they found out that there were 5,000 computers out with ransomware and they're asking for comment. And these are the types of injects that you can put in. Same scenario, same start basically, taking the same threat and mutating it for the level using some injects, a volumetric inject in this case. So you can start with something simple, something easy, something generic, and then make it fit the audience, make the details fit the audience as well, based on some very, very simple injects. And for all of this, all you need is a pool of simple injects. We've provided some, and you don't need to know exactly how a specific type of ransomware attack occurs. You just need to be able to pull out these details to help the participants practice their response. Now, what about advanced organizations or highly experienced and mature organizations? If an organization or the participants are going to be able to handle all of these simple injects in stride, they're going to be able to handle them without a problem. You might not know it, but if you've done that preparation step beforehand in the STOic process, you should have this understanding that they really know their stuff. If they know their stuff, then you need to come in with different type of inject. And this is something that we think really works very well and can work even if you're not a cybersecurity expert. For instance, I have run tabletop exercises with an organization, and I could tell from the first couple minutes of presenting the scenario that they knew exactly what they were doing. These were highly experienced, expert incident responders, and just simply increasing the volume wasn't going to mean anything to them because they were going to treat 50 computers and 50,000 computers exactly the same way. The processes were the same. That the fact that it was an end user device or the CFO wasn't going to change the scenario for them. It wasn't going to increase the difficulty. They were going to treat it the same. The process was going to apply, and their expertise was going to apply in both cases. So how do we challenge and how do we discover the gaps in such an expert and experienced group of people? The tip here I have for you is to grab real narratives of real attacks. This does two things for the facilitator. One, you don't have to be an expert in cybersecurity, because mostly if you use news reports of the narrative of an attack, there's enough detail there to explain things, but there's enough timeline there and enough narrative there to give you something to work with. The other thing it gives you is that it gives you a timeline, it gives you details, and it gives you a sequence to follow to keep you on track. You might not get to the end of the sequence as it was written or as it happened in a real attack, and that's fine. You can certainly cut things off or end the scenario or end the threat or end the attack, the imaginary attack, at any point. That's not a problem. But a narrative and a timeline of a real attack gives you a lot to work with. The trick here is to find a source of enough information about attacks. And in the guide, we have a few suggested resources where there are reports and high-level reports, not highly technical reports, but high-level reports with enough detail and enough of a narrative there for a facilitator to use. And so I have used this specifically from my own experience as a cybersecurity expert in some of the attacks that I've experienced or the attacks that I have read about. And so I keep these timelines as notes for me as a facilitator, and I can simply walk through a participant group through an actual attack that has happened to other people. So I know step A happened, then step B, then step C. And I just simply present the scenario one step at a time, just as it happened to the other organization. For advanced, experienced, expert participants, they are really going to appreciate this because they get to practice their skills against something real and something with some detail, something with some meat to it. And this is really, really handy, and this makes you as a facilitator look really good. So one of the things that you're going to need for the preparation and building the scenario and gathering the injects that you need, one of the things you can do is look for examples of that attack happening to other places where the narrative has been filled out. And you can use this as a backup just in case you need it. The other thing you can do is at the very end of the scenario in the exercise, when you're cleaning up, you could create a parallel between the scenario that you've presented there, right there in the exercise, and this real incident that happened to someone else. And you can compare their responses and the attack to something real so that they understand that this wasn't just imaginary, that they were actually doing things that would have an impact on containing and recovering from a real incident that actually happened somewhere else. So those are the 4 things you need to gather while you're building a scenario. You've got the threat, the level, the initial impact, and the injects. The guide and this video have provided a diverse pool of things that you can grab and things that you can pull from, inspiration that you can have in order to have those resources available for you at the exercise table in the moment so that you can adapt and change the scenario as needed. And it also helps you build up that scenario in your own mind so that you can progress through that imagined scenario.